It's loading up right now.
The February 24th meeting of the Corvallis School Board is called to order at 6:46 p.m. I apologize to members of the public. We're trying to watch the executive session run late previous to this meeting. The first item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oregon law allows public meetings to be held entirely online in the interest of public health and safety for all community members, especially for immunocompromised individuals and their families. The Corvallis School Board will continue to hold its meetings online. Public comment is available at some of our meetings. Information about how to provide public comment is available on the Corvallis School District website. Additionally, the board agenda and packet, as well as the link to the district YouTube channel, are available on the school board page on the district website. Public meetings are live streamed on the district's YouTube channel, and a recording is posted to the same channel, typically the day after the meeting. I'm grateful that this technology makes it possible for more community members to view and/or participate in school board meetings, given the flexibility of Oregon law. Tonight we have two directors in attendance, myself and Director Al-Abdurrah. Directors Adams, White Bear, Jones, Baker, and Tomini are attending via audio and video. Due to technology and connectivity limitations, some individual participants attending may have their video off, some are at all times. The first item on our, second item on our agenda is the resolution number 220203, the local option levy. So we have Olivia Myers, our push here.
Hi, everyone. I don't have any verbal presentation or anything for you. Last month, you received a full report that provided a lot of background on the local option levy and how it works and how we use those funds. The action requested tonight is to adopt a resolution calling for a measure election on May 17th, 2022 to submit to the voters of the district the question of authorizing a renewal of our local option levy for another 5-year period. The resolution is part of your packet tonight, and we also included all of the, as Exhibit A, all of the formal filing documents, ballot measure language, and explanatory statement language. Tomorrow is the last day to file the request for ballot title, and so we plan to do that tomorrow morning, pending your action tonight.
Does anyone wish to make a motion to approve this item? The motion wording is in your packet. Vince?
I move that resolution number 22-0203 be adopted to call a measure election on May 17th, 2022 to submit to the electors of the district the question of authorizing a 5-year local option levy renewal.
Seconded. It has been moved by Vince and seconded by Sammy. I will entertain final discussion. Does anyone have questions? Sammy.
I just want to ask if possible, I believe at the last meeting there was some extra information or reports that was there. If we could amend it to the packet for tonight, so if someone, member of the community or the media are looking into the resolution, they can see the background information that was there. Is that possible? If I remember correctly, there was extra information there, right?
We presented information from the survey that was recently completed that included priorities.
Yeah. I would say probably, there's no objection, if we could do that. For the reasons presented in the survey and the discussions we heard from the community, from our teachers and students, the continuation of this levy is very essential to conduct our business, and we're very thankful for the voters for continuing to renew it. And I do hope and urge the community to support it come May election. And I'll be in support.
Does anyone else have discussion? So it has been moved by Vince and seconded by Sammy that, oh, Therese, sorry, Therese, thank you.
You don't have to apologize, Sarah. It's not like you were just in a long meeting with a 5-minute break before going into another one. I just wanted to, I guess, reiterate really Sammy's point about the importance of what this levy allows our school district to do. I also want to well, first, thank you to the community for the past support of this. Please continue to support it. I also want to just make a comment that our community's ability to support this levy is fantastic and wonderful. The need for local communities to supplement their school district's budgets in order to provide the services that these levies allow for us is still a significant equity issue in our state and in our country. I feel privileged that Corvallis has a history of offering this additional support, and privileged to be able to live in this community. But I want to recognize, in balance with that privilege, that not all of the communities in our state have that opportunity. And so I want us to support this. I also want us not to take for granted the opportunity that this affords our kids. And to the extent that we can, let's continue to raise this issue of equity with our state so that they might bring a solution that can truly deliver a top-notch education to the entire state.
Thank you, Therese. Anyone else? Okay, so it's been moved by Vincent, second by Sammy, that we approve the we move that resolution number 220203 be adopted to call a measure election on May 17th, 2002 to submit to the electors of the district the question of authorizing 5-year local option levy renewal. Director Jones, how do you vote?
Aye.
Director Adams.
Aye.
Director Al-Abdullah.
Aye.
Director Baker.
Aye.
Vice Chair Tomini.
Aye.
Vice Chair Whitehead.
Aye.
And I vote aye. Resolution passes. Now we have the presentation about our McKinney-Vento and family advocate and mental health systems of care. So we'll have a report from staff.
Yeah, so as Sarah came and presented not too long ago related to our students navigating poverty and houselessness, that we also wanted to make sure that we had a chance to bring the team together to provide a picture of the supports that are in place for our kids as we've been moving through this pandemic. And some of these supports are newer in the array of supports we're able to provide, and some of them are longstanding. And so to have a team come tonight to present together, we felt would be really valuable and paint a broader picture. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the team to go ahead and share.
Thank you, Ryan. Good evening, everybody. So as Ryan mentioned, Sarah and I were here a few weeks ago, and we did kind of a dip into the McKinney-Vento version of this conversation, and then alluded at that time that we wanted to come back and have kind of a bigger conversation about the services. So just as kind of an aside or a reminder, the intention here is, as our programs have grown in supporting students and families, we're trying to kind of move these conversations out of isolation into a much more comprehensive set of services, which is a reflection of your health and wellness goal as a board, as well as kind of the overall goals that we have around racial equity and the intersection with areas of kind of more marginalized populations, and all of the services that we've tried to kind of levitate to make a much more comprehensive approach to how we're working with students and families. I think the other piece to that you'll hear and see in this report is our attempts to really continue to promote the neighborhood school as a focus for students and families to get their needs met and be connected. And so every year, I think over the past 5 or 6 years, I feel like we've made really critical moves to get us in the direction more and more where students and families are going to their school within their community to find what needs they need to be met, instead of a kind of removed model where you might be accessing a service somewhere within the district, maybe removed from your building. And this year, the more significant move toward that, in addition to mental health moves, was the introduction of family advocates into a number of our schools who hadn't previously had that resource. So you can see that in the report, but I want to be able to call out that that's a part of kind of not only our commitment to health and wellness, our commitment to equity, but also just this commitment to the communities that are connected and thriving as a unit tend to be much healthier, long-lasting communities where people stay connected and get their needs met, and therefore feel a part of their school and the community that's kind of connected to their school. And that's one of the pieces that we're trying to emphasize. So I think Sarah is going to mention a few pieces, and Joe as well. And then we mostly wanted to be available to answer questions that you might have after a much larger report with a lot more information in it.
Thanks, Sabrina. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be back again this evening and to be able to bring you a little bit more of that comprehensive McKinney-Vento data, but also that deeper dive into our family support program, which is so much more broad than that. And I was really excited to be able to have an opportunity to get into a little bit more of the narrative and not only the numbers. So again, so happy to be here, and I really look forward to your questions.
The only thing I'd like to add before we get into questions is just my continued appreciation and thanks to the board, and also to Ryan and Melissa. The Corvallis School District continues to be the only school district in the state of Oregon that operates its own fully functioning behavioral health clinic. And that is something that I appreciate deeply. And I hope everybody here is proud of the work that has been done by the team, because it is simply unique. So we're happy to entertain any questions about all of the components of the report. Feel free to fire away.
Who has questions? Vince?
So I think I can speak for the board in saying that we are keenly aware and are highly proud of our behavioral support clinics in our schools, and you can count on us for our advocacy in that area. You know, this is a wonderful report. Thank you so much for the data. That was really exciting to read this report. Clearly, you're doing amazing work. However, I found this report really troubling because it paints a pretty grim picture. I mean, it shows increasing need even before the pandemic. I mean, I see a structural and an increase in need and an intensification of need, especially when I overlay our youth truth data over this. It really paints a very, very troubling picture. And I'm really concerned. There's mention of foundation funding supporting a lot of this programming. And, you know, when I think about funding from the foundation, I think of that as funding to fill in gaps. And I think when we originally started this work, you know, years ago, that's what we were thinking. But this is clearly, that is not what is happening. We're meeting a systemic shortfall. We're addressing a systemic failure. And so, and maybe I'm just asking the wrong question. I'm asking, maybe I'm just processing externally here, but I'm really concerned about our ability to continue to meet this increasing need and have the resources and capacity to do this work, and how that's going to impact our students' progress academically as well. And so I guess there's not a question in there other than maybe, how do we see this work continuing? How do we see us stepping up to this need, this growing need that, you know, we're not clearly meeting it now, but the need is going to be growing as, you know, in the foreseeable future. So how are we going to do that, I guess, is my question.
I think I'm going to offer a couple of broad things, and then I think it'd be nice to hear from Joe and Sarah in a more specific way. I appreciate what you're saying, Vince, about, you know, some of this predates COVID, right? We're not talking about something that comes just from COVID, but I think it's really hard to talk about what it looks like to move forward from this point on without talking about COVID, because COVID has so dramatically impacted our staff as well as our families and students. And we certainly see a racial disparity in impact, as well as how people have responded to the impact of COVID. And so when I think about how do we maintain this work moving forward, I think there isn't a way to do that without thinking about what we know about staff turnaround in the next 3 years and staff impact from COVID, and how many people we will lose because of how intense working in schools during COVID has been. And what that leads to, as a broad answer to your question, is that we have to think about then who is going to be working in schools over the next 5 years when people have to step away because COVID has had such a significant impact. And what does that mean about how that will impact what schools look like, as well as the community at large, right? The county can say the same thing. And so when we think about that in a broad way, I think we have to think about these are situations that occurred prior to COVID, but who we are as a response group is so significantly impacted by COVID that you can only think then about what it means to respond over the next 5 years comes from who we are now. And that is directly from the pandemic. But that's kind of broad sweeping when I think about the nitty gritty of like, what does the mental health work look like? Or how do we serve students and families navigating homelessness, and particularly students who maybe intersect as students of color or other more marginalized communities? I think there is some specificity to that too, that Joe, you might be able to add.
Yeah, I can speak to a little bit of that. I also like to hear from Sarah too. So in terms of mental health structure, I mean, I guess I would call out Vince, the mental health program is actually not funded by grant structures. We're funded at this point 79% by Medicaid dollars. And so the goal is to be on track to be 90% self-funding by next year. And I will say, I use that number a lot. I've used it in a lot of meetings, and it's important to me because 3 years ago, people told me this was not feasible to do this, and there wasn't money or staff to do it. It feels good that that was an incorrect assessment. And so in that respects, I do think what Sabrina and I see when we talk with other districts and other community members and folks at the Oregon Health Authority and the Behavioral Health Division is a shift in mindset and a shift in perspective that we knew there was no reinforcements for this. We knew the mental health system wasn't prepared to step up to this level of support. And I think we took the action to move forward on that. So the hope is that we're now going to see systems that are responding to that and saying, hey, we need to make a shift in structure. And that's what we're advocating in terms of where we situate services and how we structure them. We're also engaged, and I'm really working with some folks at PSU as well as folks in our district to think about, to Sabrina's earlier point, what is workforce development in human services? We don't have enough mental health providers. And at this point, frankly, the flip side of an integrated mental health educational model is how do we as mental health providers learn to train our own? And where can we learn lessons from the educational system to build a workforce literally from our students forward? And that's why one of the goals in our structure is looking at peer services, which is the first development of how we're teaching students who are ready to learn those skills to be prepared for that. And then where are we building partnerships with organizations across the state to ensure that those students have a pathway into education in the profession. And specifically, close to my heart is how are we identifying students of color who have the interest and we can cultivate to join this profession, which is predominantly white. And that's something that we need to shift in order to make the impact that we want to make. So I think funding wise, we're at the front of things. So we're going to have to push the system a little bit to catch up with us. And I do think it will be some work going forward. Sarah, what are your thoughts on McKinney-Vento and family advocacy work?
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add, but I do think while acknowledging, of course, we know resources are not adequate to truly meet family needs, and there are lots of gaps in the community. I do think one of the things that we've touched on in previous times that we've been here is that as our team has expanded and our capacity grows, our ability to really connect with community resources grows too. We're able to know more, we can attend more meetings, we can, have closer relationships with community partners. That allows us to connect families to things out in the community and not rely only on our foundation funds to meet needs. That has also allowed us a little bit of time in the last year or two, and this is still early, but to look a little more upstream in terms of developing relationships with like some housing developers and some new housing, affordable housing units that are going into Corvallis, hopefully in the next few years, and developing some direct referral pathways for our families. So I think that, the more that our staff capacity grows, the more that we have all of those other avenues to meet family needs that isn't just the funds from the foundation. And then, our ideal situation is we're using those funds only when there is no other way to meet needs. And, truly it's trying to fill as many of those gaps as we can, which is not to say that we can fill all of them, but we're able to fill more when we work in that context of other community organizations.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that very rich response. Yeah, it settles me a little bit. Thank you very much.
Sammy?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really impressed by the work you're doing. Truly, lives and families being saved and dreams not being missed, and being able to really help kids continue to pursue their dreams and be as well as they can be. And it is really hard reality to see how challenging the work is. Also, it's very promising and encouraging to see the leadership, the names of the staff. I see more names and I see more work being done. And also the snapshot of family support services, the qualitative data that you're sharing around those specific things that you do. It really speaks to what Sarah Devon mentioned, is looking upstream and trying to do as much upstream work as possible. You support it. When we fight fire, we need to fight the fire, but we need to know why the fire is happening and think about the root causes. And there are so many social and health and employment and housing elements that are causing all of these issues. And our school staff, family support services are doing this work. Really appreciate it. I would like to ask you actually about one element or aspect when you help a family get on the waiting list for HUD Section 8 housing assistance. And if you have seen any patterns, what is the difficulty of getting the Section 8 housing assistance? What kind of barriers are there, and what can be done to eliminate those barriers, whether within the district or outside the district?
That's a great question. So I would say a couple barriers right off the top. One is that the wait list typically is taking 2 to 3 years. So it's kind of a first thing that we do when a family moves to town is we will help them get on that list, and then all of the affordable housing like through Deb Northwest. But that's not an immediate solution, and we know that. The other thing is that, at least the last I heard, and it's been a little while, the success rate of folks who finally get their voucher through HUD is extremely low, like much less than 50%, because the amount of rent that is given through that is really low, and it just doesn't match the market rates that we see. So it's an important thing. We want to do it for everyone. It's better to get on it and not need it in the end than to never be on it at all. And it does not get someone housing right when they're here in town and they need it. So there have been some other different kinds of vouchers that have existed, like through CSC and other places. So those are things that we've been able to fast track some people into housing like much more quickly. We also are just always looking, some of the barriers too are that if you have a voucher system, you need to be able to be approved for an apartment. That doesn't give you housing, it gives you rent if you can find somewhere. And so we'll also work on things like helping people take rent well classes and pieces that can address eviction histories, poor credit, the kinds of things that are going to be tricky for a landlord. So it's not, so we always want to do it. It's an important piece, but it is not a solution. And it is not something that is just like this direct pathway into housing, which is also why, some of our abilities to have like memorandums of understanding and work closely with our affordable housing developers, they don't have the same kinds of requirements if it's a family that we're working with, and we can often address barriers that might have to do with eviction histories and things like that and get people into housing more quickly that way. Did that answer your question, or do you have any other pieces to that?
No, it does, really, thank you. I would like to even think upstream why the waiting list is there, or what can we do about it? Like, I understand probably that's outside our purview. All what we can do is help people get wait listed and encourage them to apply as soon as possible, right?
Absolutely. And I think also just, the more affordable housing that we have in the community, some of which is well below market rate, the more sometimes people can get into that housing without waiting for a Section 8 voucher, or at the very least, when they get a voucher, they have places in the community that they can rent with that amount of money.
Yeah.
I think the other piece to keep in mind too is when we think about moving into a community, right, and finding affordable housing, that what we know about that as a sustainable option for families is that they also then have to have affordable food and affordable childcare and affordable access to transportation and work. And one of the things that we know about Corvallis, bearing my argument about why Fred Meyer's in Corvallis is the worst store ever, is that families can't access clothing, diapers, underwear, socks, shoes easily in this entire community. So when you think about getting a family solidly placed into housing, as well as their ability then to access a neighborhood school, helping someone to do that who then can't get childcare or basic needs for their family met in the community, it's better for us to set them up in a community where they can then afford the food or afford to get the things that they need to take care of their family. And so when I think about barriers, I think about both how do we even get people into housing, but then I also think about getting people into housing in a community that isn't prepared to sustain them is not actually helpful either.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Lou?
Oh my gosh, Sabrina, thanks for bringing that up, because it's really frustrating to hear like this really classist like perception of how to get your needs met when you have children in this town, and saying like, oh, somebody can just drive to Albany if they want something like Target or Walmart. And I'm like, what if you don't have a car? You know what I mean? Or there's all our gas to get anyways. Don't get me started on that, but it's one of my biggest pet peeves about the community. I love living here, but you literally cannot buy kids like socks and underwears and shoes in this town. And those are like basic necessities, really, right? For a child to be clothed. Like, I would think so anyways. I mean, some kids unfortunately don't have those items, but it is really frustrating. So I feel for families who have even barriers stacked on top of that. So anyways, that was my little rant. Thank you for bearing with that to get to the question. I was looking at the data and I can't remember if it was, I don't think it was in the last one. Do we have information about LGBTQ plus students in the last data set that we got before? Because I'm still have a lot of curiosity around that, just knowing the trends of students that come out as teenagers, especially, and how that's incredibly linked to into houselessness and homelessness for queer youth. So I kind of have questions about that, or if it's just not collected, or if it's one of those instances where it's like we don't want to out students even further. So I just was kind of curious about that. And I had another question about the data too, because data.
Yeah, I want to jump into the question on the LGBTQ community, Lou, because that one's really close to my heart for lots and lots of reasons. So it's difficult to collect because that information isn't sort of stored in a traditional fashion. And I know in the mental health team, I'm working to collect that material informally through the team members to sort of ask who we're serving. And I'm particularly interested, as is the whole team, to make sure that we're careful with that, because actually just recently there's been multiple students who actually have come out to folks on our team for the first time. And so we're holding very precious information, and the population, and as large as the numbers aggregate are, when they get deaggregated down to building level, we could really accidentally out people in a way that's not okay. And so we are working on collecting that for mental health. I think there could be some potential, Sarah, this would, not to put you on the spot, potential for looking into similar kinds of things for family advocacy, but it would be definitely something we do non-traditionally. And I would be interested in looking specifically at the larger queer community, as well as folks who present as trans or genderqueer, just because for mental health specific information, those specific individuals in the genderqueer and trans community just have much stronger lifelong concerns and impacts from having to navigate trans identity in a world that is not necessarily trans friendly. So.
I muted him. I stayed muted. I was just saying, thanks, Joe. I understand like protecting the data. That's why I was like, I don't necessarily expect to see it on the reports, but I'm just am glad to hear that you all are doing that, even if it's behind the scenes. And I think that's important for the community to know too, because there are a lot of things, as you mentioned, to consider with the LGBTQ community. And there's just so many links to homelessness, especially with youth, and it creates some really dangerous situations. So thank you for doing that work behind the scenes the best you can. My other question, if it's okay, has to do with another question. Well, it is a question comment, is the population comparison. I did like the quick calculation to see like kind of more of a per capita rate of like representation, and notice some significant populations that are overrepresented, even though they look really small in the data. And so it's just like a data point, since all the information is there, it'd be nice to have that on there so folk can understand, like, just because a population is really small doesn't mean that there's not a huge need for that population. So one of them has like a 20% percentage rate of that population set. And so just wanted to point out that small numbers don't mean like huge need for those communities. So I'm glad we can see this, and not everybody's going to sit there and calculate that, but I do. But yeah, maybe some other people in the community do too.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you for calling that out. I think that's really important.
Therese?
Thanks. Actually, Lou just made a point that I also did quick calculations over here. And just for the folks listening in on the conversation this evening, I think it's important to just as a reference group, our largest demographic in our community is white students. They represent 2% of the students that navigate homelessness, as opposed to other non-white students who are representing anywhere from 6 to 21% of their population is navigating homelessness. So those are, that's a big variation, right? And if you're a community of students that has, only less than 100 people in your community identifying that way, and then 14 of them are navigating homelessness, that's significant to that community, not just for the 14 people, but for the rest of the community that isn't those 14 people, but who are linked in many ways to those individuals. And so it's a significant difference. And I only just gave those numbers because not everyone can see what we're looking at, or will have the opportunity to dig in and look at those numbers. But I think that spread is important for context. So I actually wanted to share in Vince's concern that some of the numbers are just really hard, right? Like they're hard. Again, if the people in the community are interested, like, this is really important information, so please seek it out. And if you don't know how to seek it out, hey, email a board member, we'll help you do that, because it's really important for understanding the this is a community process. It's going to require community solution. I had a couple of questions. So one question is, for the students that fall under the dropout rate, do we have any information about whether those students go on to complete a GED, or are they're just dropout, and so then our knowledge of them just kind of ends there?
So it depends on where they continue on. So if they return to us, so let's say they drop out but return to Harding Center, for example, and then get their GED, then yes, we track them in our data and they become a part of a different category. If they drop out and move to Albany, then they are tracked in a greater scale of data, but not necessarily in our data as completions. And so it really depends on where people pop up. It's also, as you know, not uncommon for students to get their GED a number of years later, not necessarily in the next year, in which case that data doesn't get tracked all the way back to, you know, that correlation, especially if you're looking at 5 or 6 years later. I don't know what the average year is now, but I know that a number of years ago, the average year for when people came back to get their GED was like 6 or 7 years later. It wasn't, you know, the next year. And so it kind of depends. Lori, who knows all things about all things, might have a better answer to that. But I think, you know, it really depends on where they show up in terms of whether or not we can reflect that longitudinally.
Thanks. I had figured that probably we don't have a clean mechanism for knowing that for all of the students, maybe some of them. So that makes sense. The observation I'm just having about the academic outcomes is that it's evident that, you know, we've been within, you know, a point or two. It seems like we're a little flat on, you know, the gains, like, right? Like, so we've got about the same percentage of students in poverty that are graduating over time, even a little bit of a dip this past year, but around close to the same percentage of students that are utilizing McKinney-Vento are graduating. And so it indicates that all of the things that we are already doing, we're probably getting all the boost we're going to get from those on closing this gap. And so it's an aspirational question. It's not one I'm expecting anybody to have an answer to this evening, is what thing can we do, or what thing should we do next to try to move the needle on these numbers? Just realizing that all of the efforts, of which there are many, again, community, look at the effort that the school district is putting into this work. It's really important work and a lot of collaboration. And also it seems like we need to keep doing those things to keep these numbers and to sustain them. But those things in and of themselves may not move us much further in on closing that. And so I guess that's kind of my big question is what do we do? Do we have a targeted approach, or how do we get one? What's the next step in getting one to close that gap some more?
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off, Teresa.
No, please.
I think there's a ton in there. It's a really good question around just how do we really center the achievement and success of our students who are most marginalized. And so first off, I would say I am not entirely sure that we've maxed out on all things. So like I want to put some light into that discussion and say, you know, the last couple of years have been particularly hard. And the last couple of years, we've also brought on resources that are pretty mighty. And so when I think about the addition of family advocates, especially family advocates that are rooted in buildings, whereas lots of districts across the state have those, but they might have 2 or 3. They're located off-site. They really target in specific things. These are family advocates who we're hoping to keep working in our schools, in a community, building long-term relationships and helping people to feel cemented and connected. So that is going to help, because relationships and being seen and being supported are a huge issue. Also helping to keep people fed and helping them to get on housing so that they can actually be stable is really important. And so when I see the work that Sarah's team is doing, that's what I see running around. I also really think that the advocacy this board does related to issues that are, right on the edge of your purview in terms of, educating and advocating for affordable housing and other kinds of resources are really important. This conversation is important to raise that level of information in our community that, I smile, but it's really true. The conversation Lou and Sabrina was having, like, it really is almost impossible to get socks and underwear in this town. And that feels really odd for a town who has so many PhDs.
Yes.
It seems like an odd circumstance to be in. And we're also a community that experiences really profound income inequity. The community health assessment made this really clear. That's been done a few years ago. We're one of the most income unequal communities in the state. And so really this report is highlighting some things that are really troublesome, but I don't know that it means we can't do anything about them. I don't want us to necessarily be paralyzed by inaction, because we are. This board has done that by supporting programs like this, like the family advocacy program or a mental health program. And I think we continue to really think about how are we putting this on the ground in schools, not real far away, not real distant, not with a lot of gateways, not with a lot of barriers, which is the model of many other community programs, but right there. So if you're a parent and you show up at school and you don't know what to do because you just rolled into town, that school has somebody for you to talk to about what your need is. And that over time, that will pay dividends and make an impact. So
I think the other piece about that, Joe, that you said is over time, right? So if we think about, we introduced mental health supports to secondary schools this year. We've only been in elementary schools for 3 years. We introduced a family advocate only just 4 years ago. And then we've introduced a whole bunch more this year. And I think about, as much as we would like that work to have an immediate impact on academic accomplishment, it's time, right? It's time that has to be put in repair and restoration of relationships and building relationships and building spaces that feel safe for learners. And it will just take time before we see that reflected in our data. And it makes a lot of sense to me too, to your point, Therese, like, okay, so we did all this and still, like, what does this mean? And I think it's a fair question. And it means what we know, which is these things take time to show up in the data because the work is slow. Building relationships with family can be very slow work.
Well, thank you both for that. Oh, sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
It's okay. I was just going to say, I can say anecdotally, when we've had this larger team, even just for these past 6 months, my perspective coming from, I used to be the one that would be trying to put out these fires and meet these needs in a school, but not being based in that school and not being there every day. And so I can already tell you that I have observed as this team is kind of finding their footing and getting to know staff, and staff are beginning to understand more all of the things that they can offer to families, that we have already prevented evictions. We have already learned of family needs much sooner than we would have if it was just me. And if it rose to the level that they were like, oh my gosh, we better call Sarah. So I am seeing that just left and right, that space within buildings is really allowing us to begin more of that upstream work. And these are, half-time people in buildings. And even that has just been, phenomenal to see kind of how a lot of that prevention is already starting to play out.
I appreciate you guys taking time to answer. And it's like almost as soon as I finished asking the question, I was like, oh my gosh, wait, we haven't had enough time for these things. So thank you for very politely reminding me that we are doing some things that we haven't seen the results of yet. I appreciate that. And my apologies for not actually thinking through that it does take some time and saying that out loud. So it's amazing work you guys are doing. Last thing I just wanted to say is on the point about, raising up our own, I'm just wondering about whether or not we have pursued collaboration with.
Therese,
yeah.
Way over on this topic.
Oh, are we? Okay. I'll send an email then.
Yeah. Send an email.
Great. Yeah. I don't know how much time we have for these things, Sarah. Don't we just talk until we're done? Isn't that our policy?
And the problem is that this is a topic I think we could all just sit here and have a discussion on all night long, but we have other things on the agenda. One of which is a data thing, which we know we're going to go over. So thank you so much, Joe, Sabrina, and Sarah, for coming and sharing this just critical work with us. And one thing the pandemic did was show us the just essential role that schools play in our communities and in supporting our kids and our families. And I've been really proud of the work that you and our district have been doing that in response to need that was already there, but became even more clear. We've expanded our capacity to do that support and to give our kids the stability and care they need to learn and then meet their potential. So thank you very much for sharing this and for all of the work you do for our kids.
Thank you. We're grateful
yeah.
to be here and I appreciate it. And I can't not say that if we didn't have Ryan and the school board being willing to run front on this, there is no conversation. Joe and I are visiting with school districts all over in California and Oregon and Washington, and a dog who's also enthusiastic. And I can say that no one is making progress who like this, because the first thing they're saying is, oh, our superintendent isn't at this conversation, or our school board isn't really ready to talk about this. It's a huge thing to have this level of support, and I can't say enough about that. So thank you.
So we could go on, but the next item on our agenda is another topic that we all love, our bond project and the Pivot Architecture Additional Services Request for College Hill and Harding Center.
And so we have Dale and Kim joining us to talk us through that.
Kim, would you like to kick off or would you like me to?
Go ahead, Dale.
Okay, so the College Hill project was one of our earlier projects initially. And as we were working through the design of that project on the mechanical electrical systems, it did become apparent that a lot of work needed to happen in the older two-story portion of the building. And it would have required lots of opening up walls and ceilings and structural elements. And so it presented an opportunity to increase the structural capability and seismic strength of that two-story portion. We knew that that might be a heavy lift to fit in the funds, so we put that part of the project on, hold and moved to other projects. The hope was that as we approached the end of the bond program, we would have identified, sufficient funds to enable us to pay for that project. In fact, last summer we had two separate estimates that confirmed our choice in that matter, and then we released Pivot Architecture to execute that seismic design for the two-story portion of the building. Then more and more pandemic impacts became evident. We bid through 4 or 5 other projects, if I recall. I can't remember the exact number, and that expended some of our available funding to get those to completion. And then also the bids came in for this College Hill project, and unfortunately they did come in higher significantly than both of the estimates that we had previously received. So at that point, it was obvious we needed to shift our thinking and dial the project back to eliminate that two-story seismic portion. That required Pivot Architecture and us and the district's personnel to come up with a list of items that would be removed from the project, requiring extra design effort. The estimate has confirmed that we're on the right track. We've gone through a process to pre-qualify general contractors, and 7 qualified firms were approved to bid the project. The design will complete in about 1 month, and it'll go out for bids. And we anticipate coming in within our target and the work starting this summer. But what I just described took a lot of effort by Pivot Architecture and the rest of the team. Pivot's contract did not include this scope of work, so we need to compensate them for that.
Does anyone wish to make a motion to approve this item? The wording for the motions in our packet. Vince.
I move to authorize staff to execute an amendment to the professional services agreement with Pivot Architecture for the College Hill Harding Center renovation in the amount of $605,000. Oh, $614.
There's a second.
Second.
Is it Therese? So it's been moved by Vince and seconded by Therese. We'll now entertain final discussion. Vince.
Well, it's with a heavy heart. I made that motion. It was really exciting to consider what was possible at the Harding Center, and I have every confidence that the team did everything that they could to try to preserve that project, and hopefully that idea floats around, and maybe in the future the board and the district can come back to this idea of restoring the Harding building and having kids in that part of the building. So thank you for all the hard work. Thank you to Pivot Architecture for helping us go through that.
Lynn?
Super similar to what Vince was going to say, is just like, I know that can be really disappointing, especially when you're like lead on this project. And so I just wanted to thank you, Dale and Kim and everybody else that was involved with finding a way to still have a positive impact on that school that fits within, as much as possible, fits within the scope of the budget that you had in mind. And so I just wanted to recognize that. I know that was probably hard for you all too, and say thank you.
We're still gonna meet the bond promise here. But it was a stretch goal.
I have a question. So I was thinking about this, the idea of this potentially being something we did in the future. So I was wondering about the design for the current project, and if that was being done with the, so that those two projects could sort of blend together as those, if the other building got renovated in the future.
So yes, to answer that, Sarah, we are archiving all of the designs for the structural improvements. And what we will be able to do in the future, if we decide to go back and do the structural improvements, we can just pull that portion of the design, the layers that are structural related. Of course, there will have to be some architectural finishes that will have to be replaced if we were to do that at another time. But ultimately, we're trying to do the mechanical upgrades to the two-story portion of the building with as minimal impact on the surfaces and architectural design, so that we can avoid doing that work twice in the future. I also want to reiterate what Ryan said, is that we will be able to accomplish all of our bond promises. And in addition to that, we'll be able to really accomplish a lot of the priorities that our design advisory committee laid out for us. So some of the special design features that they really were excited about will still show up in the project moving forward. So yeah, as disappointed as we were when this came up, this is still a huge win for our bond program, is that we are at the end of the program and still accomplishing all of our bond promises, and in a way that's really meaningful to students.
I have a question. Kim and Brian, as you highlighted that, I want to highlight the full side of the cup. This was a stretch goal. It was not the promise, and we were hoping to accomplish it within our capacity. But one thing I know overall in the whole $199 million is that there were some other stretch goals that were accomplished, especially with the seismic upgrades. Could you highlight what additional funds, not necessarily in College Hill, but overall in the bond, that we were able to secure, specifically with the seismic upgrades? Were there any opportunities where we received state funding or matching funds that allowed us to do that? Because as I really navigate this, unfortunately, we couldn't do a stretch goal. I want to celebrate the other accomplishments in context.
We did get other funding for seismic improvements. Jill, I think you might be better equipped to answer where the other additional funding came from, but we did get seismic improvements at all of the buildings that we touched with our bond program. And so the only school that we didn't touch was Linus Pauling Middle School, and that was already seismically designed as a shelter. And so we are very lucky in our district to have a high standard for seismic stability at this point.
Additional state grants were provided from the state seismic program for what were called the JAWS schools, Letitia Carson,
Catherine Jones Harrison and Adams.
Harrison and Adams, thank you. And then also there was a grant for the Muddy Creek School.
But just about every one of our projects had funding in it. For
That's correct.
And so,
Thank you.
whereas there have been some
We can't hear you.
accomplish the whole building, we still did an amazing job of spreading that equitably across the district.
Could you repeat what you
Yeah,
just
we
said?
missed-
Your, you know how sometimes your speaker comes in and out on your computer? That's what's happening.
Can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Okay, so every one of our bond programs or bond projects had seismic, no?
No, it's doing its thing.
Kim was saying that all the projects that we touched had some element of seismic work. So there was an equitable distribution of work to stabilize these buildings.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you. So it has been moved by Vince and seconded by Therese that we approve we authorize staff to execute an amendment to the professional services agreement with Pivot Architecture for the College Hill Harding Center renovation in the amount of $605,614. Director Adams, how do you vote?
Vote aye.
Director Al-Abdullah, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Director Baker, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Director, our Vice Chair Tomini, how do you vote?
Aye.
And Director Jones, how do you vote?
Aye.
And Director White, or Co-Chair White Bear, how do you vote?
Aye.
And I vote aye. The request passes unanimously. Okay.
Good night.
Thank you.
So the next item on our agenda is the data presentation. And Therese, just so you know, we have 20 minutes scheduled for this.
And
We
I'll lose
had-
my mind.
we have 60 minutes.
So we do, it's wrong. Okay, I've been updated. We have 60 minutes, but it's on my script is 20, so, yeah. That's, yeah.
So, I'd like to, you all have all had a chance to.
Do you have a question, Lou?
I just need to be excused really quick to restart my computer. So I just am letting you all know I need to restart this real quick. That's all. Sorry for interrupting, but I'll be right back.
So I wanted to have a chance to make sure that we had the chance to hear from Lee and Lori tonight. Lee and Lori have been working closely together since the beginning of the school year, really focused on the assessment information and the assessment data that we have, as well as how that information is used at the school level. And so they are going to be presenting tonight some information around achievement data, around heat truth, basically the data that we have available to us at this point in time, coming out of the pandemic. And so really understanding that this is, in a lot of ways, some baseline data for us, knowing what work has happened throughout the pandemic and where we go from here. So what I would recommend, Chair, is that they have a chance to go through their slides and then answer questions at the end. They have a pretty solid slide deck and a lot of data to share, and that might be the most efficient way to move through it.
Okay.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah, let's hold our questions till the end.
All right, so then with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee and Lori.
Thanks, Ryan. So I am Lee Santee, and I'm actually coming to you as the Research Assessment and Growth Coordinator for the district. Okay. Lori, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I was clapping my hands while you were introducing, and then all of a sudden my screen flashed and I thought I did something to it. I'm Lori Corvallis. This is my 28th year in the district, and I am so happy to be working with Lee. It's given me new energy. Still think I'll retire in a couple years, but I'm having a lot of fun right now.
We have been pulling a whole lot of information together, really looking at different ways we can look at progress towards board goals. So before we jump in, the only thing I would like to say is just set the stage for you all, because very often we have been noticing we'll be talking to people about data and they're thinking, oh, you're going to give us the answer. We're going to have an answer when we look at this. And I hope to reframe tonight's discussion that my goal here is that looking at this data will focus us into asking really good questions. And I think it probably will raise more questions than answers, and that there's not anything wrong with that. Really, there's always, we want to go deeper and deeper, and I hope that the data will allow us to do that. So we're going to jump in, and Lori and I are going to kind of go back and forth because there's a lot of information here, and some of it might fall out of my head, some of it might fall out of Lori's, but we hope we'll get there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I would just like to start by recognizing a piece around equity awareness and data visualization. So we recognize that the data visualizations sometimes mislead, misrepresent, and harm communities that have already experienced inequity and discrimination. So we're making efforts to use design elements that don't limit or create judgment. But these visual design elements may include a color palette, a chart placement on a slide, or word choices. And so we just want to open it up and say if there's anything about the design aspects of the presentation that creates discomfort, please let us know so that we can improve for future presentations. Okay, you ready, Lori?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's jump in. Next slide. So we designed this to really align to the board's goals. So the first pieces of data we're going to look at are focused around student achievement and equitable systems. We'll look at third grade reading, successfully completing Algebra 1 by the end of ninth grade on track, 4-year graduation rate, and racially and culturally diverse staff demographics, some information about student experience, and you'll see in here, we are talking about these two goals together because much of the data may address components of each of these goals together. So we didn't want to separate them out. Okay, next slide. So the first piece of information we're going to be looking at is STAR data, STAR assessments. So as you all know, we don't have state assessment scores for the last 2 years because we did not do state assessments, which is often where we look to for that first step of looking at student achievement. STAR assessments are shorter tests that we give in both reading and math. Computer adaptive, so they will adjust depending on how students answer. And teachers use that information. It's nationally normed. They'll use that along with classroom data to learn more about what students already know, where they're ready to go next, and to monitor student growth. Okay, next slide. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a guide here. On all of our slides, you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner, it will give you an indicator of what board goal this data is related to. There, you will also see a symbol. Tonight, we're going to be talking about both percentage data, so if you see a pie chart in the bottom corner, that means that we're just looking at percents. There are also some pieces of data that are counts of students or counts of staff. And you'll see tick marks if it's a count. And the reason we did that is just a lot of information on these slides, and we just want everyone to get lost.
Lee, when you lean back, we lose you.
What's that?
When you lean back, your voice cuts out.
Okay, so I'm getting in closer. So this first piece is around STAR reading English scores for third graders. The green portion of this graph represents students that are at or above the benchmark on STAR third grade reading English scores. Presently, 50% of students in the fall scored at or above the benchmark. 16% of students scored on watch, which is, we want to just keep an eye on those students. 8% of students scored in the range where we need to be thinking about systematic interventions for those students, and 26% of students scored in the range of urgent intervention. So I know we mentioned in the board report, what we'll jump into next is actually STAR reading in Spanish. And I just want to give a little explanation that at this point, we don't have a way to say a student is reading at third grade benchmark regardless of language. We can show you how they're reading in English and how they're reading in Spanish, but just because of the limitations of the assessments at this point, it's difficult to answer the question, are they reading at benchmark? And the reason I point that out is that in a minute, you'll see that there are a number of students that are reading at benchmark in Spanish. This data does not show if these are the same students or different students than the students that are reading at or above benchmark in English. So this gets a little bit muddy, and I just feel it's important to explain that because really our goal is about students reading at benchmark in third grade, regardless of language. Okay, next slide. This is very similar, STAR Spanish reading, and in fall of 2021, 27% of scored at or above benchmark, 11% on watch, 26% in the intervention range, and 36% in the urgent intervention. Okay, Lori, before I jump into disaggregating that data, do you have anything you want to add around STAR scores?
No, I don't believe so, other than just to clarify that the students who took the STAR reading Spanish were not just native Spanish speakers. So it was all the students in DLI.
Thank you. Yeah, so all of our students, this is third grade, so all of our students at Garfield and Lincoln took both STAR reading in Spanish and STAR reading in English. Okay, so next slide. This is still looking at percentages, and really what we wanted to look at here is disaggregating this data by federal, race, and ethnicity categories. So before I jump into what all of these pies say, I will just say that we are always talking about when we want to include data and when we need to suppress data. And this is not a hard and fast rule. It is not an exact science, but we want to be mindful of if there are any pieces of data that are so small that they could identify individual students. We want to make sure that we are not unintentionally putting identifiable information about individual students out for a presentation like this. So What that means is we really use the number of 10 or fewer as our starting point. So if there's a group of represented that is 10 or fewer students, we really will have a discussion about whether or not we can include that data without unintentionally identifying individual students. And that comes up a lot when we disaggregate data because numbers will get smaller and smaller. What you can see on the left is a pie chart showing all the third grade students that took English STAR, all of the test takers. If we disaggregate the students that took the test and we disaggregate by the federal race and ethnicity categories, our 100% of test takers looks like this pie. And then what we did was we looked at the group that scored at or above benchmark. And we looked at how that group looked when they were disaggregated by federal race and ethnicity categories. And then the on-watch group, the intervention group, and the urgent intervention group. So there's a lot on this slide. Really, I would say an important takeaway here is that Latinx students are underrepresented on the above benchmark and on watch categories. So that would be the light blue slice of the pie, and that there's an overrepresentation of Latinx students in the urgent intervention category. So Lori, I just went through a whole bunch. Is there anything that you feel like needs to be explained about this?
No, I don't think so. Only in a general sense that this is, as you said earlier, this is a starting point. We don't make decisions about what to do with kids based on one data point. We always use more information. So this is just a starting point for buildings to look at.
Great, thank you. Okay, next slide, please. We ran the same sort of disaggregation looking at our STAR Spanish reading scores. So the population of our test takers looks different because this is Lincoln and Garfield students who are participants in the dual language program. And you'll see that we have 3% of Asian students who are in that program at third grade. They are not represented when we group down because the numbers were so small that we would have been identifying individual students. Is there anything else? Okay. So next slide, please. And I'm going to let Lori jump in on this one.
Okay, I think this is probably a familiar display that most of you have seen before. This is our chart of students completing algebra. In other words, gaining a credit of math in their freshman year. And this is a local metric. This is not one that ODE produces for us. However, we do use many of the ODE groups that you're familiar with. The Hispanic Latinx, the white students, the students navigating poverty, students with disabilities, emerging bilinguals, and every EL. The ones that we've created internally, locally, are the students of color and the students of color not Hispanic. There's a gap in the Ever EL because that year ODE did not produce a third period spring membership collection, which is what all of these are sort of based on. And that wasn't one that we could replicate internally. The other ones we could, but this one we really couldn't, because Ever EL means going back potentially, 10 years of data to find out if someone was an EL at some point. So, so that one we couldn't produce. Before we go to the next one, I wanted to talk about the students of color not Hispanic. I don't know how many years now I've heard concerns that we can't share data about small groups, and been thinking about that a lot and how to get around that without exposing student data inappropriately. So one of the things that I experimented with actually today was how we might be able to combine years for some of those groups, like the Black students, the American Indian Alaska Native. If we could somehow say, okay, well, how did they do over a 3-year span? Because we could combine, their numbers. And so when I did that, I combined the American Indian Alaska Native for 3 years. It was 1819, 1920, and 2021. And they had better than 95% that successfully completed Algebra 1. When I did it for the Black students across that same 3-year span, they were 82% that successfully completed Algebra 1 or higher. And with the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, even after adding the 3 years, we couldn't get to a threshold that we could report, unfortunately. I didn't separate out the multiracial who are included in that group of students of color, not Hispanic, in part because this is the tricky thing about exposing data. If I give you all of the little subsets, you could kind of reverse engineer to get to how a small group performed. So, but I'm also not I'm not trying to hide anything, but that particular group is not considered in ODE reporting to be an underserved group. So, and we do share data about multiracial students in many other reports. So, and we could have here as well. It just wasn't a group that the board decided to focus on. So that was a lot of words. Sorry about that. And I think we can go on to the next slide. This is the 9th grade on track, which we get from Oregon Department of Education. And they did not report anything for this collection for the 1920 school year. So there's a gap for every one of those. And on track just means that they've earned 6 credits by the end of 9th grade. It does not consider the quality of those credits, either in terms of the grade earned or the content of the credit. That is something that the high schools do look at separately. They will particularly look for, did the student complete a math credit, a language arts credit, a social studies credit? But as far as this collection is concerned, it's just about, how many of them got 9 credits or 6 credits, sorry. I don't think there was anything else to add about that. Lee, did you have anything?
I think you did a great job. Thank you.
Okay. And the next slide. This is also one that I think you're all familiar with. This is our grad rates, our 4-year cohort grad rates. And this is the one I think Ryan refers to as a spider web. And with the target being the very center. So we're moving towards the center, and with some groups getting there a little faster than others. There's an asterisk next to the EL group because that metric has changed a little bit since from 2013 to 2021. In 2013, they used to call it ever EL. So they were reporting on any student who was either currently or ever EL in their K-12 career. And then they changed it to former ELs who exited before they got to high school. So if they exited by their 8th grade year, and part of the reason they did that is in their research, they were finding that students who exit EL services by the end of their 8th grade year have a much better chance of graduating on time when they get into high school. If they're still in ELD when they get to high school, particularly if they've been in ELD for a number of years, their chances are reduced. And then the other thing about this group, the former ELs, they graduate at a rate higher than their never EL peers, which for me highlights the asset of what these students bring. We can go on to the next slide. This is really the same information. It's just kind of illustrating what the impact is on students in terms of counts. So if we were to apply the 12,013 rate to our current students, or sorry, how do I say that? If we had applied the 12,013 grad rate to the current number of students that we have, we would graduate 91 less students. So it's just a reverse of that. So it's just showing it in terms of a count instead of percent.
I think that's I always really appreciate that, because as you think about our graduation rates and the number of students that leave with a diploma and additional opportunity over those years, that's a significant number of students that we're now preparing to leave with a diploma and in greater opportunity. So to me, that's really that changing it from percentage to number is really profound in that, as we think about it that way.
May I add something? Sorry to interrupt, but if I may. Ryan drew a comparison and the economic impact of that, the 91 students, the difference between a dropout and a high school graduate is $260,000 for their lifetime. So that's in earnings. So that's doing the math real quick. That's a lot of money, millions of dollars that we're introducing, $23,660,000 in earnings for the local economy and for those high school graduates. And for many people, that's the impact of our investments in equity. So when people say equity, what's the utility of it? It's giving our students those dreams, but also this amazing economic impact.
Yeah.
The only thing I wanted to add was that we're not focused on the 5-year cohort, but they're a success story as well. They're just not part of the board goals this year. Me personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with graduating in 5 years. I just think we want to graduate. And we can go on to the next slide, I think.
So we wanted to share with you what is happening with the percentage of racially and ethnically diverse staff. And these numbers may look different than what you've seen in the past. And we changed the way that we collected this information. So in the past, HR has done a great job of sending out the information the way that they have to report it to other organizations. We really wanted to align the way that we were sharing this data to the same way that we look at this for our student data. So actually what we can do is there is a collection from the state that has been looking at this. So right now, that's why we have historical data. But this data actually includes teachers, principals, library media specialists, and guidance counselors. And that's because this is from a validated collection. It doesn't include classified staff, but we did collect that data.
They were losing you.
You can't hear me? Can you hear me?
Like when you turn, I think turning your head is a problem.
Sorry.
Just sit perfectly still.
I will stand right in front of the computer. I did pull the data for this year, and about 49% of our staff are classified staff. And if we were to look at classified staff, approximately 21% of our staff are classified staff or staff of color. Okay, next slide. There's also number of pieces of data from Youth Truth. I know that all of you on the board are familiar with this, but just really quickly, Youth Truth it's a student survey that we administer to 3rd through 12th grade students. And we ask students to share their experiences at school. And these are the categories, the main categories that we look at. But we pulled out some pieces that are very relevant to board goals. Okay, next slide. So when we asked middle school and high school students, when talking to adults at my school, I feel comfortable talking about my race or ethnicity. And what you see here is percent positive, meaning the percent of students that responded positively to that statement. So overall, 59% of middle schoolers, 60% of high schoolers responded positively to I feel comfortable talking about my race or ethnicity when talking to adults in my school. And then this is disaggregated by the federal race ethnicity categories that are identified through Youth Truth. Okay, next slide.
Lee, I would only add that on those, these were self-reported by the students.
Yeah, so at middle and high school level, part of that survey, it asked students how they would identify racially, ethnically, and gender identity and sexual orientation. So that's all self-reported by the student. At the elementary level, any data you see, that is aligned to the data that we have when a parent registers a student. This question was, when talking to adults at my school, I feel comfortable talking about where my family is from. And again, this is just the percent positive of how students responded to that question. Okay, next slide. We also looked at that same statement. I feel comfortable talking about where my family is from. 70% of emerging bilingual middle schoolers felt comfortable, and 62% of emerging bilingual high school students felt comfortable talking about where their family is from. Okay, next slide. When talking to adults at my school, I feel comfortable talking about my gender identity. And again, at middle and high school level, students self-identify their gender. So this is disaggregated by how they identified their gender. Okay, and next slide. Okay. That is the big, huge chunk that really addresses the student achievement goal and equitable systems goal. And we have some data now for real world learning. You can go to the next slide. Okay, Lori.
Is that mine? Okay.
That's you.
Okay, and all of you are familiar with CTE. We decided to put a definition up there for others who might be watching the meeting. And also to really write down what the definition of a participant and a concentrator is for ourselves, if nothing else, because it seems like we have a hard time finding the definition when we need it. So we wanted to put it on the slide. I think there's a third category as well, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's a more advanced version of CTE, something beyond concentrator, and I wish I could remember the name, but I don't. We can go to the next slide.
One of the reasons why we wanted to make sure there was some common definition at the beginning of each section is because we knew some folks would watch this on YouTube, and so they'd have a chance to better understand our data, but also we knew that we would add it to the packet as a PDF. So starting each section with some descriptors was meaningful for those people who are going to digest that data in that way.
Right, they didn't get to listen in. So, so on the left is the grad rate for the CTE students, and for the participants, it was 92.8% last year. There were 461 CTE participants. And then for the concentrators, the rate was 93.2, and there were 220 students that were considered to be CTE concentrators. Over on the right are numbers that were from the 2019-20 school year, and those don't match because the ODE collections for that part of it for CTE are always 1 year behind. So I can't update those numbers until they actually give that information to me. But that's what it looked like in 2019-20, and the programs at the bottom were the ones that were offered in 2019-20. You can go to the next slide. And so this is talking about the Oregon State Seal of Biliteracy. It was designed to provide a rigorous proficiency-based recognition of the linguistic assets and academic skills of biliterate graduates. In order for them to gain the seal, they have to meet all the graduation requirements, and they have to take an assessment, sometimes more than one assessment, to demonstrate proficiency in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. There is currently a proposal before the state board, which I think they might be hearing about in another month, or maybe the second reading, to add a seal of multiliteracy for students who demonstrate proficiency in 3 or more languages. We've had a handful of students in the past who would have been eligible for that, and they just received 2 seals of biliteracy for the multiple languages that they had learned. You can go to the next slide. I should say that Corvallis was one of 4 districts who piloted the program with ODE in 2014, and actually they didn't bring the program into being until 2015. So those 2014 graduates were retroactively awarded the seal of biliteracy. Most of the students meet the requirements through an AP language test, but some also use an assessment called STAMP or ACTFL or portfolios, and sometimes, especially in the last 2 years with the pandemic and the nature of having to deliver an assessment virtually in some cases, they had to use more than one assessment. So they'd have to do one maybe online and then have to do a portfolio for one of the other parts like writing or something like that. And Spanish is the top language through which the students earn the seal. The additional languages we've seen over the past 3 years were Chinese, French, Portuguese, Italian, German, Japanese, and Korean. And then on this chart, you can see that there were 448 seals that have been earned over the past 8 years. You can go to the next slide.
So going back to Youth Truth Data, one of the questions that we asked was, do you discuss real world issues that need solutions with other students or with your teacher? And so this actually just shows we asked students in 2018, and then we asked the question again in 2021. And so you can see middle school students in 2018, 27% responded that they discuss real world issues that need solutions with other students, and 30% responded that, positively to that statement in 2021. Okay, next slide. We also have some Youth Truth data that really pertains to health and wellness. So we wanted to focus on that. Next slide. So student perspective. So this is looking again at the growth between 2018 to 2021. The statement was, when I'm feeling upset, stressed, or having problems, I know someone outside of school who can talk about it, who I can talk to about it. My school has programs or services that help me. And there's an adult from school who I can talk to about it. So this just shows how students responded in 2018 and how students responded in 2021. Okay, next slide. And again, this is going to school and life outside of school. And So the question at elementary level looks like, does your teacher ask you about your life at home? And at middle and high, the statement is teachers try to understand life outside of school. And again, it's a comparison from 2018 to 2021. Okay, next slide. This one, this is one that is kind of an opposite slide. We hope that this goes down because the statement is, have you ever felt so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks that you stop doing some usual activities? So this is one of those that positive and negative gets very confusing. So our hope would be that students do not respond positively to this statement. So this was one where we would hope we would have a negative slope in our graph where it would go down and less students would feel so sad and hopeless. So it just, you kind of have to switch your brain when you're looking at something like that. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is actually, as Lori labeled it, our bonus track. You are probably aware that when it was winter of January 2021, a work group came together to look at how we had been identifying race ethnicity through our registration program. And look to see if we could expand that locally. So the work group included Black, Indigenous, and people of color, including CSD staff, health navigators, Delta community members, family liaisons, interpreters, translators. The goal was really they started using the equity lens questions and using the protocol from Courageous Conversations About Race to have a collective dialogue about how traditionally our schools have collected race and ethnicity information at registration, and if we could expand how we do that locally. Lori was involved in all of this work, so I'm going to let Lori jump in and talk about what came up from that.
Okay. Where to start? First, it was a privilege to be part of that group. It really was. I learned so much and learned about some of my colleagues and their lives and experiences that I hadn't known before. So that for me was a big takeaway. We were aware of a group in Washington State that it's called the Cedars Project, and they had done some work at disaggregating some of their federal race ethnicity categories. And we looked at some of that work. And then as the groups were meeting several times, it was hard to narrow down in a common way. In some groups, they were sort of leaning towards countries as a way of disaggregating, and in others, it was more about traditions or things like that, culture. We finally settled kind of on regions in some cases. Even that wasn't perfect, but our conversations kept going, and we wanted to get something in place in time for the April 2021 registration period. So we came to an agreement on the initial categories that we wanted to include. And you'll see those here in a minute. So the students that were enrolling new in April, primarily kindergarten, those parents had an opportunity to choose those different categories. And then in the summer, when everyone goes through registration re-enrollment, parents had the opportunity to adjust what had been set for their child before. I would say that probably not a lot of them did that. They just accepted what was already in the system and moved on. Because if any of you have gone through Registrar, there's a lot of screens and a lot of questions, and anything that was already in there that you'd already answered, you probably didn't pay a lot of attention to, and you just kind of moved through. So anyway, you can go to the next slide. This is what you are used to seeing with our race ethnicity groups. This is our current enrollment as of February 11th, 6,464 students. And it shows the breakdown by race ethnicity. Quite often, what we find is that under federal reporting categories, students who might identify as American Indian Alaska Native also have checked the Hispanic box. And so they're reported as Hispanic Latinx because that overrides everything else. The ethnicity of Hispanic overrides all the other categories. And that's how that category under federal guidelines is reported. If the parent does not choose Hispanic, and there are multiple races chosen, that's how multiracial comes out. So that kind of helps explain a little bit, I hope, about how the federal categories come from our data. And you can go on to the next slide. This is a screenshot that I took from our SIS. This is an actual student. And these are the choices that parents now have when they register their child. You can see at the top, there's the Hispanic yes, no. That's a required question that is separate from the race categories. And then parents have to choose at least one box in all of the little boxes below. They can choose as many as they want. They have to choose at least one. If they choose boxes that are under a single column, then their federal race, as long as they're Hispanic, no, their federal race will be reported as that category. So in this case, if this student did not have South African checked, but only had white checked, their ethnicity, their Hispanic Latino box is no. They have two boxes under white, they would be reported as white. This student has a box checked under Black or African American, as well as under white. They're not Hispanic or Latino, therefore they'd be reported as multiracial. You'll notice some redundancy in some of the combo federal categories. For example, with Black or African American, there's a category called Black or African American. There's Black, there's African American. It wasn't our intent to include the combined one originally, but our ESD pointed out that because of all the longitudinal data they had that was specifically linked to that category, they had to leave it in there. So we have a category called Black or African American, and we have one called Black, and we have one called African American. Yeah, I think that's, oh, the other thing is that this particular family chose to include some information in the write-in box. I've seen a variety of information in those boxes. Not all parents put something there. Sometimes they'll put Guatemalan. Sometimes they'll describe, they'll say, well, dad was this and mom was this. I mean, it's really a free-form box. It's for them to put whatever they want. Lee, is there anything else to say about that before we go on?
No, I think next slide sounds good.
Okay. Is this yours or mine?
Oh, I can do this.
Okay.
The pie chart is exactly what we saw before. So American Indian Alaska Native under the federal guidelines, it looks like 1% of our student population identify that way. When we actually looked at the reporting information that we got with the new structure, there were 540 students that indicated at least one racial identity under American Indian Alaska Native. And of those 540 students, only 42 were counted as American Indian, Alaska Native for federal reporting. 343 were counted as Latinx and 155 were counted as multiracial. So we are really hoping to gain insight from this so that it can further inform how we are disaggregating data in the future and what categories we're looking at. You can go to the next slide. We did the same thing when we looked at if we were using the federal definitions. 92 students in our student population would have been identified as Black. That's 1% of the population, but 324 students indicated at least one racial identity under the Black African American group. Of those students, only 92 are counted as Black under the federal reporting. 59 are counted as Latinx and 173 are counted as multiracial. Next slide. And we also looked at the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. And if we use the federal category, the federal identification, 23 students would identify in that category, but 100 students indicated that at least one of their racial identities was under that group. And 18 of those are counted as Latinx and 59 are counted as multiracial. Okay, I think, oh my gosh, I think that's it.
So I think that we need to talk about the so what now what part of this, Lee.
Thank you. Okay, and so really, you know, as Lori was explaining, this is really new to us. This just we just started collecting this data this year, and our hope is that it really gives us insight because we often talk about disaggregated data. And we hope to have to gain a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about different groups, who are represented in those groups, and is there more information that we can glean by having a better idea of how families are identifying rather than just relying on the federal race and ethnicity category. So I think this is aptly under bonus track because there's more to come here. And I think this is just the beginning of the conversation, but it's really clear from this information that that there is a much richer and deeper conversation that needs to happen than just relying on federal definition. Lori, would you add anything else?
Yeah, two things, and I hope I can remember them both. One thing that we have to look at and figure out is how to make sure this information gets in the hands of teachers so that they can really see the richness of the students in their class, the diversity, and then hopefully plan some of their instruction, you know, around that. And pull in different cultural aspects that would be relevant to the students in front of them. And then the second part is our intention when we started this work was to, that this was a starting point. So for example, you see that Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander only has 2 categories under it. And in even some of the other ones, this was really just a starting point that the group could all agree on, with the idea that in another year, we would potentially expand it. We would kind of look it over and expand it. And I think that work is going to be put off a little longer because of our shift to Synergy and a different student information system coming up in 2023-24. And Synergy currently only accepts the federal race categories. So our ESD knows this is important to us, and so they're anxious to get their hands into the Synergy programming so that they can bring over this data and we can still have access to it in the new student information system. I think that was all I was going to add.
Okay, and that's all we have to present. I'm sure you all have a number of questions.
So two things I'd like to share. One, going back to the last few slides that we looked at. Another area that I'm optimistic and hopeful around is that I think this is a great model as we look at, as if we were able to take what we just were able to share with you and have it be part of all the other data that we're collecting, how rich that conversation becomes. And so for me, that's an area that I feel that as a board, as an organization, where we have influence and opportunity to talk about assessment and how to utilize this depth of information, I think it would be really valuable. And that's why we wanted to share it with you. And also it leads to my appreciation for this team, for Lori and Lee, working closely alongside one another to come and say, hey, what do you think about this? This is what we were able to pull together from this registration information. Do you think it's something we should share with this group? Well, absolutely. And thanks for pulling it together, because it really helps us to begin to think about this, who our kids are in a deeper way. So with lots of appreciation for this team, I know that they'd be happy to answer questions, but I feel like that is, I think, based on the conversations we've had over time, I think this helps us to move in the right direction.
Okay, so Lou, you start out.
Okay, I just want to throw this out there that those last slides bring me so much hope, because like literally I've been asking about this for like 2 years, right? Probably the first thing I engaged with the board was a conversation about disaggregated data, and that's what I meant with the multiracial category and the category labeled as Hispanic, just because I know what's in there is going to give us a different story, not only for understanding the experiences of the students we serve, but also to help shift the way that we talk about students in more of a deficit model, where it's like the low numbers, so we can't talk about it, it's too bad. And it's like very like erasive, and I really appreciate this work so much. Y'all don't have any idea. But I'm wondering if there was Indigenous people who involved with the conversations of developing the categories and stuff, or if it, like, if you know specifically, if there, you don't have to tell me who, it's just like if there was, obviously I don't need to know who. So that's a question about that, because it did say Black, Indigenous, and people of color specifically.
Yeah, so Marcianne helped us kind of identify who all had been involved. And I know she was, we had one of our groups was with Delta and the Safe Students and different ones. I couldn't name the person, but I believe it was someone from OSU.
It might have been me, but because I'm in Delta, but I'm just saying, like, I was just wondering, because like there's some things that stood out to me from an Indigenous perspective where I was like the final review part, like, did that happen? I don't remember seeing that, but one thing to just keep in mind that not all people that identify in the Hispanic or Latinx category identify as Indigenous. And if they then have to pick a category, and then under the American Indian Alaska Native, there's like Central and South America, that could skew the data a little bit in ways that aren't salient to their own identities. So if they don't identify as such, so that's just something to consider about how that category is laid out. I did have questions, or not questions, it was, I don't know how to use the STAR data right now because of all of the erasure that happened with the data. I understand why, but it's hard to like really understand what's going on with the students without being able to see what's reflected. And so like as a board member who is like takes responsibility of like, how do I advocate for things to help students, and are we meeting our goals and stuff like that? I can't really evaluate that with the data that how it's written. And so that's why I'm saying like this other end data, hopefully in future years, we'll be able to better evaluate the equitable systems goal, because right now with it, I'm like, I don't understand like how we can, just because so much is missing.
So can I speak to that before you go on?
Sure, because the other one was shifting to something else.
Okay, so we will have end of the year assessments as well, around with STAR. There are times when we worry about the amount of assessment between Smarter Balance and doing STAR in the spring. But because of where we're coming from with a lack of data over time, we're going to have that expectation for this year. So we will have data to look at fall and spring with STAR in a way that's probably more reliable and valid because of the number of students participating in it. So I want you to, that's a great question. And I'd like you to think about it as a pre-assessment and rather than a summative at the end of the year. It was our baseline for us to get started as we came out of the pandemic.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'll keep that in mind for like thinking about it, like, okay, now we know where the starting point is and everything. And
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. In the youth truth data that was on there, I don't remember where we have too many, not too many, we have a lot of meetings, and I was like, was this in what setting was certain things shared in? But I will say that if I haven't said it before in a board meeting like this, that the data from middle school to high school, both with the specific racial demographic and gender demographic data showing that not feeling like they can talk about themselves or feeling comfortable or connected, that shift from middle school to high school, it going down specifically for certain racial demographics, and then the gender, certain gender demographics, it really, really stands out and tells me that we really have some work to do as a district. And so I know I'm confident that you have plans in place, Ryan, but I appreciate Lee and Lori capturing that data so we can kind of check ourselves with our actions as a board and like what we're advocating for with policy and other actions. So that was more of a statement than a question, I guess. I'm just confident that you have a plan, so I would think so.
Vince.
So goodness, there's a lot of conversations to be had in this day. Well, first, I want to back up. Okay, so global pandemic, one of the hardest things, because school board members, we live in a boardroom. We don't get to be in buildings. We don't get to see kids. And particularly in a global pandemic, we can set foot in a building. We were in CDL for a year, and then, we've been excluded from it. I have not been in a school building for 2 years. And we haven't had data, and it's been one of the most unsettling things. So all y'all who work at the district office or, principals, you guys get to see the kids, you get to talk to your educators, you get to have a sense of what's going on. We have been flying blind, and it has been really, really unsettling. So I have to tell you that getting this report and actually seeing charts of real data and outcomes for kids is just really, really comforting, even though there are tough conversations and tough questions in that data. Goodness, we could spend the rest of the night talking about the stories that are in this data. So, but I'm not going to do that. Really, I just want to make a comment and really ask you to think very boldly about these categories. When I think about the history behind the Census Bureau's racial categories, that is a very troubling history. And it is high time to get rid of it. So I really, for this board, for the district, I really urge us to step back and think about how we want to navigate this data and how are we going to slice our data so it will serve us and serve our kids. And I just want us to think very creatively about that. I mean, what you've done is a big step forward, but there is definitely there are other entities out there. The United Kingdom is one that comes to mind, where they do a really good job of capturing race ethnicity data for their population. And it's the UK. Come on. I mean, they're not cutting edge. So, I mean, there are folks out there. They're not. I mean, come on. So I just want us to think really boldly about this. And so as you know, clearly it's going to be a couple of years before we really are able to settle down with this and get what our categories are going to be, and then have a data system to support that. But I just really, let's take the time. The other thing that I think I see you guys creating data products, lots of data products. And there's a lot of labor tied up in that. And I'm just wondering, can we do a data dashboard? Can we do that? So it's really easy for Lori to just go, I'm going to take this spreadsheet and upload it. And then you're done. You don't have to create those data visualizations. It's there, it's on the web, and you can screenshot it and drop it in onto a slide, and we're good to go. I just see us, we're there. So, I'm looking at Ryan because, I think it's time. We're there. So
I wanted to go back to your comment about the race ethnicity categories.
Yeah.
And when we were doing that work, a member of the team who was in an LBL ESD said that ODE was interested in what we were doing. So our categories, when they go to the state, they roll up to the federal ones because that's what the state will accept. The state is also bound by what they have to report to the feds. But in my mind, there's no reason they couldn't do the same thing, where we send up exactly what we have and then they roll it up to the feds. So there's potential there for movement, I believe, at the state level. It just needs some advocacy from people that would make a lot more than I do.
Well, and as I'm thinking out loud here, and I mean, Oregon School Boards Association spends a lot of money on Forecast 5, and they're a national scale service that serve school districts all over the country. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if, I don't know, I guess I'm talking about my pay grade as well. So, but I think we should have this conversation. It's about time. And then I'll yield back. Thank you so much.
Right. Yeah, I think I totally agree with you on that, Vince. I think that's kind of the hope and the dream I have around this, is that those are, like I said earlier, all the slides we shared to get to the point where we shared the enrollment information. Again, that depth of knowledge and information is super valuable. And I would like to see a number of platforms in that direction.
Yeah.
Great work. Bravo. I'm really excited.
So I want to pick up on the last end of the conversation and say, yeah, thank you. I was going to ask you if you would join in for a meeting with Oregon School Board members of Color Caucus and present this work. And now I'm thinking we have a recording I can share, but also I would like to do both if Brian would accept. But really, what I would say, this is really important. We need to share it. Maybe we can draft a summary of why this is really important and share it with the membership of the caucus. Ask OSBA board, the leadership, to maybe advocate for Forecast 5 to include those categories, and with ODE as well. So probably in terms of the advocacy, I would be very excited to work with Lou and Shauna and the rest of the board and Ryan to really advocate for that. I believe it's really important. We have done lots of important work that we should be doing, but we need support from the state and other agencies to make it easier and scalable. So that's my first comment. And I would love to follow up maybe offline about how could we do this advocacy. The second comment is, this is phenomenal, really great work. The entry, and I want to agree with Vince in terms of thinking about database rather than Excel sheets, which I think is there, but database management, a dashboard interface, and that gets me to an important question. The framework for the registration is still federal framework. We're still fitting ourselves in the mold, and we don't have to. The box that combines two ethnicities can be combined in the back end, where if someone checks this box or that box, they can go there. I don't want to go into the weeds or the details, but my suggestion is two things about the registration form. Number one is think about what we're presenting, and if it's have to be the way it's presented to comply with the federal reporting, do we need to put it in front of people, or should we put it in the back end? The second question is, yes, there is a bias of skimming through and not checking the boxes. And I would suggest that we ask people to fill it up from the beginning and say, please fill it up. And if they skip it, we have it registered already for whatever they said before, but they're more likely to fill boxes if we ask them to fill the boxes rather than they say, this is what you checked, and they might skip it. There's some bias there. I don't know if that makes sense. So basically really asking people one opportunity to start from scratch and say, this is what I believe, my real identity, despite of the stamp that has been given to me or the mold that has been given to me.
We are limited somewhat in the registration tool that we use, but Lee, I'm kind of thinking that we could ask LBL to add kind of a bold statement on top of that area and just say, please review this carefully. The categories have changed.
Yeah.
Perhaps since you filled it out before. So that's the only thing I could think of that we might be able to get them to do.
I think that could be a good start.
Okay.
Beautiful. Another one, I'm not sure if I have the right answer, whether definitions or a question mark where they can hover and find out what's the definition for it, if that's useful, or we should leave it to the respondent to define it. That's not my expertise, but I'm wondering if presenting that or not presenting it is a conscious decision, and we need to include that. Last comment I have is in page 5 of the report, the first graph on the top of the page about how people feel comfort to their gender identity. This is a very important realization for us about the importance of the work that we need to do and compliance with the policy regarding discrimination based on gender identity. And it shows where the work is needed, where the work is needed most as well. So thank you for presenting it. And my faith is in our staff, policy, and teachers and students is that we're going to close that gap as soon as possible. But also I want to highlight the 4th row says middle school, and I believe it's all students, if I'm not mistaken. So just want to highlight that, and maybe if we can update it in the final report.
Thank you. Yes.
And that's all. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you, Lori and Lee. I agree with Vince that it's been hard to not have any data and feeling like we were in uncertain times without the sort of information we were used to getting. And so it's been really helpful. And the work on really learning who our students are, and I think is fabulous, and everybody's already said a lot about that, but I will echo my colleagues' appreciation for that work and excitement about what that could do for us for really understanding who our kids are and how we can support them. So thank you very much. This was refreshing to have data.
Yeah, we all love it.
Do we need a 5-minute break? 5 minutes. I kind of need a 5-minute break, so we're gonna have a 5-minute break. So we are in recess until 8:59. meeting of the school board in session. The next item on our agenda is the resolution number 220204, Women's History Month resolution. Does anyone want to make a resolution to approve this item? A motion to approve this item.
I'll second.
No, I didn't hear who moved. Whoever left, they left their. Okay,
So Vince was first?
Vince was first.
Well, no, I was kind of waving my hands trying to find the unmute button.
Okay.
Oh.
But I'll happily make the motion. I move to adopt resolution number 22-0204, acknowledgement of Women's History Month as submitted.
Thank you, and we have a second.
I'll second.
So it's been moved by Vince and seconded by Shauna. We can now entertain final discussion. Does anyone have any comments? Lou?
I just wanted to recognize the importance of passing, if possible, I plan on voting for it, but should we pass it, these resolutions and months are not just for show, they're important to help recognize the experiences of people represented in them, and also to help encourage the education that's called out for within these resolutions to happen. And I know as a woman of color, as an Indigenous woman that has been underrepresented heavily in many aspects of society and throughout my life, that these kind of resolutions don't just impact me, they impact all women, and not just cisgender women as well. And I think it's important just to pause and recognize the significance of passing these, that we're not just doing them for funsies. They're written and developed to inspire and to encourage folk to uplift all members of our community.
Thank you. Therese?
Thanks, Sarah. I won't repeat. Lou made a couple of points that I wanted to make. So instead, I'll just extend my gratitude to the board members who took time to work on this, and I'm excited to be able to support it.
Thank you, Vince.
I'd also like to express my appreciation for the authors of this resolution and bringing it forward. And I want to, remind the board that while it's wonderful that we're adopting these resolutions this year, I think it's very important that these are stated in terms of recognizing these events in perpetuity. And so it's incumbent on us to come back to this next year and decide how we're going to celebrate this event next year.
Thank you. Shauna?
I'll just add to what other board members have shared. What a wonderful opportunity with 3 schools renamed this year, named after women in history, and several who were from Oregon, including Leticia Carson, who was the first Black woman recognized as living in Oregon, according to the US federal census, because she was the only Black woman to successfully make a land claim in Oregon under the Homestead Act of 1862. And there are so many other pieces of her history, as well as others, that would be a wonderful learning opportunity along with those new school names.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else? No further comment. Has been moved by Vince and seconded by Shauna that we approve the resolution, that we adopt the resolution number 220204, the acknowledgement of Women's History Month. Director Adams, how do you vote?
Vote aye.
Director Aladra, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Director Baker, how do you vote?
Aye.
Vice Chair Tomini, how do you vote?
Aye.
Director Jones, how do you vote?
Aye.
And Vice Chair Whitehead, how do you vote?
Aye.
And I vote aye. The resolution passes unanimously. Because of the importance of this acknowledgement, we will read the resolution into the record.
Do you want us to start, Shauna, now? Acknowledgement of Women's History Month. Whereas the Corvallis School District recognizes and pays tribute to the significant contributions made in our community by all people who identify as women and girls, which includes trans women and girls. And whereas the Corvallis School District affirms that students, families, staff, and community members should be valued for all aspects of their identities. And whereas Women's History Month grew out of the local efforts in Santa Rosa, California, began by the Education Task Force of the Sonoma County Commission on the Status of Women by establishing Women's History Week in 1978 for the Sonoma School District and community. And
whereas International Women's Day has occurred globally since 1911 in an effort to celebrate the social and economic, cultural, and political achievements of women, and whereas women historically have been denied rights to vote, own property, and serve in political offices and other leadership positions until the 20th century, and whereas the trans women's identities have historically been criminalized and continue to be targeted by violence, and
whereas National Women's History Week was first proclaimed the week of March 8, 1980, and whereas Women's History Month has been proclaimed nationally since 1995, and whereas women have contributed to the history and collective future of Corvallis and Benton County, Oregon, and whereas Women's History Month provides an opportunity to continue the district's growth in learning about the many contributions of all women to the nation, world, and local community, and
whereas education is a necessary component for creating a more equitable and anti-racist community, nation, and world. And whereas the Corvallis School District has made a commitment to equity and anti-racism, and whereas the Corvallis School District has a responsibility to honor and respect the diverse histories of our community, and whereas the Corvallis School District believes each and every student must be celebrated and appreciated for the distinct and vibrant contributions made by sharing cultures, language, ideas, beliefs, and values within a school community. Therefore, let it be resolved by the Board of Education of the Corvallis School District that the board does hereby proclaim March 2022, as well as each March annually, as Women's History Month in the district, and strongly encourages students, families, staff, and community members to join in existing local celebrations, and encourages all schools in the district to help highlight this month in great appropriate ways, as well as to highlight the contributions of all women to the local community, nation, and beyond, both historically and in current times. Adopted by the Board of Directors of School District number 509J Corvallis of Benton and Lynn Counties, Oregon, at its regular meeting today, this 24th day, February 2022.
thank you. The next item on our agenda is resolution number 220205, the acknowledgement of developmental disability awareness. Does anyone wish to make a motion? Vince.
I move to adopt resolution number 22-0205, acknowledgement of Developmental Disability Awareness Month as submitted.
Second.
From Therese. It has been moved by Vince and seconded by Therese. We'll now entertain Final discussion. Lou?
I just wanted to point out with this one, because there's a couple of different disability awareness months, and kind of just briefly touch on this one in particular is about developmental disabilities. And we also included some language about folk with other disabilities as well to be celebrated during and recognized during this month. Just understanding the impact on education and some of the exclusions that have existed because of people's developmental disabilities, especially in school settings. This one felt especially important to highlight out of the different months, because there's other ones like Disability Awareness and Employment Month. I have that one a little bit off in October, the exact title, but I just wanted to point out there is a distinction of them, and so that's part of it. Sorry, it's getting late. And also, should this resolution pass, which I hope it does, and we read it, I wanted to point out that there may be things in it that may bring up some things for folk as well, in explaining the significance and importance of having a month like this.
Thank you, Lou. Any other comments? Sammy?
Yeah, I want to really thank the authors and the co-sponsors for this resolution. It's really important to recognize this resolution and its significance and where we are right now and the work that we need to do, and acknowledge the history that we're there in Oregon. I looked up one of the things that I want to elevate here, the forced sterilization that occurred between 1923 until 1981 in Oregon, and was practiced for at least 2,648 people. And until Governor Kitzhaber at the time apologized for that, and as the resolution recognized, the Senate abolished it in 1983. We need to be conscious about the injustices that happens in our community, and it's a reminder that injustices happened in our lifetime and may continue to be around us. So we need to be aware, and we need to celebrate the value and the potential of every human being. And when we see it somewhere, we need to condemn it. And when we see people who deserve to be celebrated, we need to do that. So with much appreciation, there is huge value in this in terms of learning, building awareness, and celebrating our folks and community members who experience developmental disability.
Vince?
I very much appreciate this this resolution drawing our attention to this particular group, a group that Sammy just said has been, historically marginalized, and despite all the work and the attention that this board and the district gives trying to meet the needs of these kids, we are still struggling within a system that was designed not to meet their needs. And so I just, as we adopt this resolution, as I'm sure it will pass, I want us to redouble our efforts to work towards system transformation to meet the needs of each and every kid without exception, including kids with disabilities.
Thank you. So it has been moved by Vince and seconded by Therese that we adopt resolution number 220205, acknowledgement of Developmental Disability Awareness Month as submitted. Director Adams, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Director Alatrava, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Director Baker, how do you vote?
Aye.
Director Tomney, how do you vote?
Aye.
Director Jones, how do you vote?
Aye.
Director Vice Chair Waker, how do you vote?
Aye.
I vote yes. I also, the resolution passes unanimously. And again, because of the importance of this acknowledgement, a group of members of our community and students in our schools that have been historically isolated and discouraged from participating in education. I think we should read this resolution also.
I'll begin then. The Corvallis School District 509J acknowledges this with, Developmental Disability Awareness Month with resolution number 22-0205. Whereas the Corvallis School District recognizes and pays tribute to the significant contributions made in our community by people with disabilities. And whereas the Corvallis School District affirms that students, families, staff, and community members should be valued for all aspects of their identities. And whereas Developmental Disability Awareness Month grew out of grassroots efforts advocating for human rights of people with disabilities in the 19th century. And
whereas people with disabilities have historically been subjected to institutionalization and eugenics practices in Oregon and nationally. And whereas Fairhaven Training Center in Salem, Oregon was opened in 1907 as the Oregon State Institution for the Feeble-Minded through state legislation in order to institutionalize people with developmental disabilities, including children. And whereas the Oregon Board of Eugenics was passed through state legislation in 1923 in an effort to sterilize people with disabilities, including developmental and mental health, as well as other members of society. And whereas forced sterilization in Oregon occurred until 1981 and was not abolished by the state Senate until 1983. And whereas
National Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month was first proclaimed nationally in 1987, and whereas people with disabilities of all kinds have contributed to the history and collective future of Corvallis and Benton County, Oregon, and whereas Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month provides an opportunity to continue the district's growth and learning about the many contributions of people with disabilities to the nation, world, and local community. And
whereas education is a necessary component for creating a more equitable and anti-racist community, nation, and world. And whereas the Corvallis School District has made a commitment to equity and anti-racism. And whereas the Corvallis School District has a responsibility to honor and respect the diverse histories of our community. And whereas the Corvallis School District believes each and every student must be celebrated and appreciated for the distinct and vibrant contributions made by sharing cultures, language, ideas, beliefs, and values within the school community. Therefore, let it be resolved by the Board of Education of the Corvallis School District does hereby proclaim March 2022, as well as each March annually, as Developmental Disability Awareness Month in the district, and strongly encourage students, families, staff, and community members to establish and participate in local celebrations, and encourage all schools in the district to help highlight this month in a great appropriate ways, as well as highlight the contributions of people with disabilities to the local community, nation, and beyond historically and in current times. Adopted by Board of Directors of School District Number 509J, Corvallis of Benton and Lynn Counties, Oregon, at its regular meeting this 24th day, February 2022.
thank you all, and thank you so much to our board members who drafted those resolutions for us. The next item on our agenda is consolidated action. As a reminder, the items under this portion of the agenda are for action. Does anyone have a question about anything in consolidated action? Vince?
I don't have a question. Will the chair entertain a motion?
I will entertain a motion.
I move to approve consolidated action.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved by Vince and seconded by Sammy. I will now entertain any final discussion. And seeing none, it has been moved that we approve the items under consolidated action. Director Adams, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Director Aladripa, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Director Baker, how do you vote?
Aye.
Co-chair Tomini, how do you vote?
Aye.
Director Jones, how do you vote?
Aye.
Co-chair White Bear, how do you vote?
Aye.
And I vote aye. The motion passed unanimously. And we now have board member comments. Does anyone have any comments they would like to share? Vince?
I would just like to express appreciation for the chair. You have conducted a very smooth meeting and it looks like you got your sea legs very quickly. Well done.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Can I filibuster to increase the average? Of board meetings conducted by the current chair.
I would, Sarah, I think you're like 2 for 2 on basically finishing the meetings on time.
Yes.
So that's nice job.
Thank you. Yeah, this actually says on my sheet, it says adjournment at 9:45. And
I was
it is
just gonna say we're early. I was just gonna point that out, Sarah, that we're actually early. I don't know what's going on here. Who are we?
And we started 15 minutes late. So
you have an efficient chair.
Yeah, I was up late one night writing, so I needed to go to bed early tonight. I have one comment, and that is just that with the announcement today from OHA about masks and the uncertainty and nervousness that is the community is feeling around that, I just ask my fellow board members and our community to really show each other grace at this time, because it's gonna, this is one would think that taking off a mask or other people taking off their masks would be a welcome thing, but it's gonna cause a lot of anxiety. So let's treat each other gently as we do this. Thank you. And with that, our meeting is adjourned.